Hello, and welcome to episode 18 of Not Reserving Judgment, a podcast about the latest intrigues, triumphs, and outrages in Canadian constitutional law. I'm Josh DeHaas, counsel with the Canadian Constitution Foundation.
I'm Christine Van Geyn, the CCF's litigation director.
And I'm Joanna Barron, executive director of the CCF.
In today's episode, we'll discuss a prison sentence handed down against a man who defrauded the art world by ripping off Indigenous artist Norval Morrisseaus.
We'll discuss whether you have a right to protest on privately owned spaces like in shopping malls.
We'll share our bad legal takes of the week, where we take a lighthearted look at some legal opinions that didn't quite land.
But first, Christine's going to tell us about a new bill that I really don't want to talk about, but I guess we have to. So, Christine, take it away.
So my news headline today is about porn, and I'm the one doing this headline because Josh said that his mom listens to this podcast and he really doesn't want to talk about porn in front of his mom. And look, my parents definitely do not listen to this podcast, so I am very happy to talk about this. So the headline is about a porn blocking bill called Bill S-210. And it has been called by Professor MichaelGeist the most dangerous internet bill you've never heard of. And for those of you who don't know, Professor Geist is, of course, one of Canada's leading experts on internet law. He is the Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-commerce Law at the University of Ottawa and the editor of 4 books on copyright law and privacy law. So what exactly is Bill S-210? Now, you may already suspect that it is a Senate bill since it starts with an S and not a C. And it is not a government bill. It is a private member's bill. And it was backed by the Conservatives, the Bloc, and the NDP. And it was actually opposed by some Liberals. And the name of the bill is Protecting Young Persons from Exposure to Pornography Act. And it was actually passed by the Senate this past April. The bill would create an offense for any organization making available sexually explicit material to people under the age of 18 for commercial purposes, and there are high penalties associated with it: $250,000 fine for the first offense and up to $500,000 for subsequent offenses. Now, obviously, it goes without saying that it is a worthy goal to protect children from sexually explicit imagery. The problem with this is how the bill goes about doing it. It creates a government-enforced global website liability for failing to block underage access, backed by website blocking and mandated age verification systems that are actually likely to include facial recognition technologies. And this would apply every single time a person accesses the website. So think about how websites are supposed to comply with the law. It's by establishing these age verification systems. And it effectively means that sites will need users to register with a commercial age verification system in order to access porn. But it's actually not limited to porn websites like Pornhub. It applies to any service that makes sexually explicit materials available. So that would include search engines like Google, social media sites like Twitter, websites, sort of these billboard systems like Reddit, and it would mean that every time you run a search or look up tweets, you need to go through this age verification process, and you would actually need to go through it every single time you tried to do this, according to the way the bill is structured. And these age verification systems raise real privacy concerns, in particular the use of facial recognition technology. And since the bill is really broad in scope, it isn't limited to pornographic sites, the overbreadth of it leaves the bill very vulnerable to constitutional challenge. So think about this risk of overblocking. The proposed legislation not only envisions the possibility of blocking content that is actually legal. Pornography is not illegal as long as you're over 18. It expressly permits the blocking of lawful content. And this raises the threat of full censorship of otherwise legal content under court order based on notices through a government agency. In this case, it was likely to be the CRTC. Now, as I said, this is a Senate bill, and Senate private members' bills almost never become law. But this has already passed in the Senate with multi-party support. And I think we need to be concerned. There are many policy options that are available to address the issue of protecting children from sexually explicit content, including education for parents. And my personal opinion as a mom of 3 kids is that giving children smartphones early and giving them unsupervised internet access is actually probably the biggest part of the problem. And educating parents about tools available for them to control what their child sees is a much more preferable approach to restricting access of adults to legal, although explicit, content. Pornography is not illegal. Now, putting age verification processes in place is bound to fail anyway, even with these overbroad approaches proposed in the bill with like facial recognition technology. Kids who want to get around it will get around it, just like every child in the past has been able to somehow access, pornographic magazines, cigarettes, or alcohol. We should emphasize, I think, the importance of the role of parents in raising their children rather than the role of government in raising children. Josh, I know you don't want to talk about porn, but I need to get your take.
Yeah, I share a lot of these concerns. I think either this bill is basically going to be, toothless and not really enforced, in which case it's just pointless virtue signaling, wasting people's time, or it's going to be enforced in a way that presents real problems for privacy. And the issue with privacy, and I think we were discussing this last night, actually, the 3 of us, is that you never know when you collect information what it's going to be used for later on. So this is requiring people to give their age. And yeah, it's true that, a lot of advertisers can already figure out what our ages are, and they've got these like profiles on us, but I don't think we should be forced to like give out our age and verify our age just to use websites, because you don't know. It's just more personal information being collected on you that that belongs to you and shouldn't be collected. And I do see a problem here with, pornography and especially children accessing, but you're absolutely right, Christine. Like, that's the parents' job to make sure their kids are educated about what they might see online, and to, lock them in their room and not give them smartphones until they're 18, ideally. I know it's easier said than done. Joanna, what do you think about this?
Well, this is making me nostalgic for the good old days when I was a kid in the 90s. And if you wanted to see porn, you had to go on the those like pay-per-view channels. And occasionally it would it would be like gray and fuzzy, and you'd be able to like catch flashes. We used to do that when we were having sleepovers. So needless to say, I'm skeptical that bringing in age gate requirements and facial recognition, if I was able to access flashes of porn in the 90s, I'm like pretty skeptical that you could keep any kid who has internet access, no matter what the sort of best efforts are. But yeah, this clearly is a case where the cure might be worse than the disease. But on the whole, I'm just like, more regulation, instituting more, more requirements, facial recognition. So that clearly sounds bad. On the other hand, like, I fully believe that the internet knows more about me, knows my soul better than I do.
Like, this just seems like some puritanical impulse from some party members, so the Conservatives, the NDP, and the Bloc. I think, like, it's really important to remember porn is legal. You are allowed to look at porn, and putting all of these restrictions in place, like needing to show a facially recognized driver's license in order to watch some kinky material. I mean, I'm deeply uncomfortable with that. I think that it's taking things way too far, and it's really concerning that this has already passed the Senate. Like, just get parents more involved in having awkward conversations with their children about this type of material and the risks associated with early exposure to it. Anyway,
okay.
Yeah.
Enough talk about porn. Josh, let's talk about something more uplifting, such as people uttering death threats in the Eaton Centre during the festive season.
Yeah, Merry Christmas to everyone. So you've probably seen these viral videos by now of pro-Palestinian, or in some cases pro-Hamas protesters disrupting Christmas shopping in malls. And, they're harassing kids who are going to sit on Santa's lap. And They're shutting down Indigo because it's owned by a Jew who is supporting an Israeli charity. And they're shutting down Zara because, well, it's actually hard to figure out why they're shutting down Zara. Apparently, they did some ad that some people found offensive.
The ad was messed up. If you haven't seen it, it looked like a model dressed in Zara clothes holding a shrouded body over her shoulder, like a dead body.
And weird, but it didn't seem to me to be even like a colorable reference to Gaza.
It was shot in July. It was the pictures are old.
Yeah.
Anyway, so like, but regardless, these protests, like they're super annoying. Like, I don't think anybody thinks you're convincing anyone by doing this, but it does raise this question. And the most disturbing one of these is this one where this masked man is inside the Eaton Centre and he says, "I will lay you to sleep. I'll put you 6 feet deep," which is a pretty obvious death threat. And the cops are standing there. They don't do anything. And then people are upset because the police didn't arrest anyone. And the police union is now saying, well, the victim didn't want to press charges, which is not how it works. But anyway, all that aside, what's really striking to me is just that like police and security guards don't seem to be doing anything, and they don't seem to be, stopping these protesters or trying to get them out of the malls. And it raises this question of whether you have a right to gather and protest in what are obviously private spaces like shopping malls. And the short answer is no, you don't, but it's also a little bit complicated. So, people assume that because this is private property, security guards and police have the right to exclude people from these shopping center properties. And this makes sense because, the common law says that landowners have the exclusive right to decide who's allowed to remain on their land. And this has been codified into, trespass to property acts, which make it an offense to enter onto someone else's land, stay on it, and not leave when they tell you to. And I think that's correct, that, you can't just protest anywhere you like on private property. But the law is not as clear as it looks. And that's because certain people, communists, have been trying for decades with various levels of success to argue that shopping malls are quasi-public property where you can exercise your right to free expression and your right to free assembly, peaceful assembly, that is, and that, police and private property owners can't stop you. And so, there's sort of a 2023 version of this argument, which is like in social media where people say Twitter, even though it's clearly private property, is somehow a space where you're owed free expression, where the charter protects you and your right to free expression, because this is like the new town square. So there's an older version of this, which is that the mall has become the new town square, and so you can protest there, even though the charter clearly just applies to public spaces. So I found this article. It was pretty useful. It was by someone named Lisa Loader in the Journal of Law and Social Policy, and she makes this argument that malls have become the new town square, and so you have to be able to express your speech there and assemble there and protest. So this started back in the 60s, or at least goes back at least that far, when striking retail workers wanted to be able to go to the mall to tell shoppers, don't shop at this Kmart because Kmart's bad and we're on strike. Were kicked out by mall owners, and the mall owners said they're trespassing and they were told to leave. And the picketers argued that, the public has been extended this sort of general invitation to come onto the property, and malls can't kick you out without violating your rights. And courts were skeptical of this, but the Manitoba Court of Appeal, in a case called Harrison Carswell, sided with the people who wanted to picket and stay on private property. And this went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said no. Justice Dixon wrote the judgment for the majority and found that these labor picketers didn't have a right to be on this private mall property without the permission of the owner. They were trespassing. But in 1980, the California Supreme Court sided with those people who say that, the mall is quasi-public and it's the new town square. And so you have to let the protesters protest at the mall. And then the Ontario Human Rights Commission took up the cause, and they were very in favor of a right to protest in malls. And the charter passed in 1982, and people thought maybe that changed things. So Basically, Jack Layton, former NDP leader, the late husband of Toronto's current mayor, Olivia Chow, decided to test this in Ontario in the Eaton Centre, the very place where this latest controversy happened. And he got himself arrested for trespassing by protesting in a mall after being told repeatedly to leave. And he actually won. And the case is often now held up by people who claim you do have this charter right to protest in malls. But, first of all, it was a lower court case in Ontario, so it's not binding on appeals courts or in other provinces. And it's from the early days of the charter, and it doesn't really accord with later to be jurisprudence. And the facts seem pretty limited to the case, and it certainly would not extend to like a violent protest, because if you read the charter, it only protects peaceful assembly, and so violent assemblies are not protected. Anyway, so there's good reason to believe from later cases, which I won't get into, that you don't have a right to protest in malls, that's not the case, but people will always hold up this Jack Layton case until it's settled by some higher court and say that you do have a right to protest. So that's basically my little history lesson on that. So my view is you don't have the right, but some people beg to differ. Joanna, do you have any thoughts on this whole situation?
Well, I just want to reflect on the other part, that irrespective of whether you have the right to protest in a mall, you certainly don't have the right to utter a death threat to a police officer. And also, as you said, this argument that the victim didn't want to continue with charges, which I guess was somebody that was standing right behind the police officer. That's not how the criminal law system works at all. And so I think just the second issue to consider is how we should feel about the cops rather arrogantly. And they've claimed, they tweeted out in response to, there's been obviously vocal criticism of this, because you look at other policing so-called incidents in Canada over the last 2 years, Freedom Convoy, and you see differing responses. So there was obviously vocal criticism of this, and the Toronto Police Service responded to one of these critiques on Twitter this week and said, officers were at the Eaton Centre to respond to a protest where threats were directed to a member of the public, not police. Okay, true. Yeah, the victim chose not to pursue the matter. And then TPA members are working each day to ensure protests do not escalate, and we are grateful for their efforts. So this is all can be swept under the rug of de-escalation. But it also sends a signal to certain members of the public that they can get away with brazenly saying, beyond plausible deniability, uttering death threats. So I find that to be puzzling and disconcerting, because the thing that comes next is something that is terrifying to contemplate. Christine, any reaction?
Yeah, mine is similar to yours. I mean, I immediately thought of the convoy, where people were arrested for protesting on public property and for not uttering death threats. And I'm not sure I agree with your skepticism about de-escalation. I think police de-escalation is a really good thing. I want the police to de-escalate situations as much as possible. Police have a really difficult job, and we've seen that in other jurisdictions, particularly in the United States, when police don't de-escalate, things get really bad in the US and at protests. And I don't want there to be violence. I want police to keep people separate, to keep people moving along. And in this case, I think it seems clear to me that there was an uttered threat, and we absolutely know that the victim of the threat is not the one who decides whether or not charges will be laid. I think the standard for uttering threats was probably met in this case. And even in the context of de-escalation, I think you could make arrests, especially given that you could probably somehow identify this person. There's cameras everywhere in these malls. So I think it would be reasonable to expect the police to be able to identify who made these threats and arrest him later, even if in the moment they wanted to de-escalate the situation. There's nothing that precludes an arrest later. So anyway, that's my take. When we come back, we're going to go to break, but when we come back, We're going to talk about the sentence in the Norval Morrisseaus scandal.
Hi, it's Joanna Barron, Executive Director of the CCF. Happy holidays to everyone, and thank you so much for listening, rating, reviewing, subscribing to our email list, supporting our work. It's been an extraordinary year for the CCF, from challenging the invocation of the Emergencies Act in court, appearing at the Supreme Court to make submissions against the No More Pipelines bill, challenging Calgary City Council for their draconian anti-free speech protest bans, and we have tons more work to do. 2024 is shaping up to be our biggest year yet. So if you want to support us, if you want to support freedom and holding governments to account in courts of law and public opinion in Canada, now is the best time to do so. Between now and the end of the year, a generous group of donors are matching donations up to $100,000 so you can double your impact. Special shout out to freedom lovers like Mitchell Olbaum of Toronto, who is supporting this podcast and the CCF's work defending liberty. Join us, join Freedom's Defense Team by going to www.theccf.ca/donate. theccf.ca/donate. Double your impact. Thank you, and happy holidays to you and your family. So, the ringleader of the largest art fraud in Canadian history was sentenced last week to 5 years in prison. Gary Lamont, 61 years old, of Thunder Bay, pleaded guilty to various charges, including forging artworks, defrauding the public in an amount above $5,000. And this all has to do with artworks attributed to probably the most legendary Indigenous artist in Canadian history, Norval Morrisseaus. Justice Bonnie Warkentin in Thunder Bay sentenced Lamont, and she noted several aggravating factors, including just how widespread this fraud was. It spanned almost 20 years. The amount of paintings and victims involved. So Lamont was essentially coercing other younger Indigenous people to create these fake paintings. There are thought to be perhaps thousands in circulation. The emotional and financial impact on the victims, and of course the impact on the legacy and estate of Morrisseaus himself, who has passed away. And Lamont had a previous criminal record. He was already serving time for sexual assault, drug charges, and other frauds. So as I said, he was really the ringleader in the sense that he ran a sort of like makeshift sweatshop in Thunder Bay, where younger Indigenous, mostly men, were coerced into creating these forged artworks. There was also rape involved. It's a real hell scene. And so far, it's been confirmed that 190 Lamont ring forgeries have been identified. 117 have been seized by police, but it's been estimated that there are likely at least 5,000 more fraudulent Morrisseaus paintings in circulation. Now, this story is of particular salience and interest to me because the case was brought to prominence back in 2019 when a few things happened. First, Bare Naked Ladies keyboardist Kevin Hearn. This actually came to light when he had been a collector of Morrisseaus paintings, and he had lent his Morrisseaus, one of his Morrisseaus artworks to the Art Gallery of Ontario for an exhibition. And the curator of the exhibition contacted him and said, I'm sorry to tell you this, but your painting is a fake. So obviously he sued the art gallery that was selling these fakes. But my brother-in-law, my sister's husband, Jamie Kastner, went to high school with Kevin Hearn and heard about this story. He's a documentary filmmaker. And so he made a doc about this whole affair, which he thought was kind of about art fraud and forgeries, and didn't know that it was going to lead him into this dark and sordid story of crime and exploitation and drugs. So that movie is called There Are No Fakes. We will put a link to it in the show notes. You can watch it for free on TVO. And so Jamie really bringing this story to prominence. His film opened at Hot Docs in 2019 was part of how the police became, or I think effectively the cause of the police becoming interested in this story. So I got his reaction after all of that to this particular sentence. So let's hear what director Jamie Kastner has to say about this.
Well, it's pretty amazing. I mean, it's the first time that anybody significant in this whole debacle has actually admitted guilt. I mean, as per the title of my film, ironically, it was called "There Are No Fakes" because that was the refrain of one side of this story. High and low, that's what they swore, in spite of 20 years of mounting evidence and serious journalistic coverage prior to my film to the contrary. There are no fakes, there are no fakes, there are no fakes. And here you have a ringleader admitting that there are fakes. So that's pretty groundbreaking in and of itself. Looking at the charges itself, now, I mean, it's worth remembering that as we explored in the film, art fraud is sort of only part of this story, and in kind of concurrently with the frauds being produced in the ring that Gary Lamont led, was a whole bunch of horrible sexual assault and abuse going on of young men. 2016, he was charged for the abuse of 5 victims spanning 14 years, and he was sentenced to 5 years at that point. Then he was arrested again while still in custody in 2022 and charged with sexual assault with a weapon. And kind of this past month, concurrently with having pled guilty to the art fraud for the first time, he's also been charged with 3 more sexual assault incidents between 2021 and 2022. So sorry, he was clearly out long enough, briefly, relatively speaking, but long enough to be charged with more sexual assaults, for which he has been sentenced to 2 years less a day plus 15 months pre-custody. So whatever, 3 years, give or take. So he's now he's being charged with the art fraud. This feels like some kind of math quiz, for another 5 years, less 1 year served in custody. So I mean, by my count, that comes to, if anyone alive could have possibly followed that, but roughly 7 years, 7 further years that he is going to have to serve, but 4 for the art fraud, 3 for the sexual assault. And the question always looms with this stuff, for the average layman like myself, is that fair? Is that just, what is the sort of price tag for that kind of pain and suffering he caused to his sexual assault victims, let alone the art fraud?
Yeah, well, there are questions about, so 5 years, if I look at it in the context of, and in the sentencing decision, the aggravating factors include that he already had a criminal record, but also just the scale and scope of the fraud itself and the impact on sort of like Indigenous heritage and Indigenous culture. So I'm the last person to say, we want heavier prison sentences, but in context, it actually seems sort of light to me. If we're just talking about the 5 years for the art fraud, like the scope of it, we're not talking about 2 or 3 or 10 paintings. The cops have seized, I think, 117 forgeries that can be directly traced to him. And there's speculation that there could be like thousands.
Yeah, I mean, they actually seized, when they made the arrests last spring, in March of last year, they seized 1,000 paintings in total. Yes, 117 of which have been attributed to him specifically, but that number could well rise yet. And yes, this is of an estimated 5,000 to 6,000 out there, they're saying. It was 3,000 around the time that my film came out that was the estimate, and my film came out in 2019. So yes, it is such a particular crime and or combination of crimes and particular story. And as I saw it, kind of wading into all aspects of it while making the film, it was really a story of kind of, and I think this term is bandied around a lot these days, but it's very literal in this case, of latter-day colonialism and of abuse of indigenous people on every level by the same group of people, are committing abuse that is physical, is cultural, is fraudulent, et cetera, et cetera. And these things all happen concurrently. I mean, I've spoken to people in the States, talking to Americans in the industry about this film while we were working on it, and I their jaw would drop when they heard this incredible sequence of events, of how this all happened, and then the kind of they would be shocked to hear how little time he was sentenced to at the end of this for all of this sexual assault. That was only 5 years. But I mean, I know we have a different system here that believes in rehabilitation rather than just retribution. And I believe in that in principle. Nevertheless, it does, and I know that the sentencing is always some kind of, product of a certain amount of horse trading that goes on between the lawyers, right? And for instance, in this round of sentencing with Lamont, part of the deal was that his wife, Linda Kachik, who was also one of the people arrested in March and who was clearly an accomplice to everything that was going on, the charges were dropped against her in the deal. So on one hand, I was have been a bit shocked by the low number of years that you've been hearing, like 3 more sexual assaults, and he just gets another year and a half tacked on, for instance. So my first reaction was, well, 5 years, like that's a substantial amount of time for a 61-year-old man. But then you think, well, he only got 5 years for the first round of sexual assaults. It's very hard to kind of figure out what justice looks like in this case.
Yeah, definitely. Well, it's certainly unusual that a documentary film ends up with a precedent-setting criminal court sentence. So thank you, Jamie Kastner.
Thanks very much, Joanna.
Okay. So why don't we go to bad legal takes of the week? Josh, what's your bad legal take?
Before I get into my bad legal take, I just want to tell a really quick story because this whole Norval Morrisseaus scandal has reminded me of it. So I took my niece to the McMichael Gallery recently, and it has a bunch of Norval Morrisseaus, and she was less impressed by Morrisseau than I expected. She was more into like the Tom Thompson, but the funny thing was, like every art gallery, they have a plethora of exhibitions on climate change and racial justice, because those are the two things that are just sort of hot right now in the art world. And we went through one of these climate change exhibitions, and she sort of sighed and sat down and she said, we wouldn't have these problems if everybody drove a Tesla.
From the mouths of babes, make it happen, Elon. Free Teslas for everyone.
Yeah, exactly. Her dad definitely wants one. He talks a lot about it. So my bad legal take goes to the entire Ottawa Carleton District School Board for their incredibly childish behavior over the last couple of years and their silly code of conduct process, which culminated last night in their decision to sanction one of their trustees, Dr. Nili Kaplan-Murth. So we've talked about Dr. Kaplan-Murth on the podcast before. She's famous for being a very aggressive pro-mask mandate advocate, and she sort of famously chewed out Steve Paikin on TVO in an interview, which is kind of funny if you know how gentle Steve Paikin is. And she's a doctor, but she felt so strongly about the need for mask mandates in schools long after people had realized that masks don't work particularly well. And so she ran for school board, and she then used that position to repeatedly push for mask mandates. And she lost this big vote where they considered bringing them back after everyone else had gotten rid of them. And this led to plenty of acrimony with her colleagues, her fellow trustees. So At one point, Dr. Kaplan-Meier texted a fellow trustee and she accused her of voting with the white supremacists if she voted against the mask mandate. And this is because in, Kaplan-Meier's worldview, to be anti-mask mandate is to be white supremacist. And that doesn't make a lot of sense to us, but in her mind, I think that sort of the trucker protest was not this legitimate venting of frustrations over COVID-19, but was something more akin to like a KKK meeting. And so to her, it's all sort of one and the same. Problem is this trustee was Black and she was not happy to be accused of white supremacy, which is understandable. So these various code of conduct complaints arose. And at this later meeting, another trustee brought this up and she said, Kaplan-Meier was a white woman attacking a Black woman, referring to this text message incident. And this made Dr. Kaplan-Meier, in her signature move, go ballistic. And she said, "I object. You will not characterize me as a white woman. I am a Jewish woman who's received daily anti-Semitic death threats for standing up for my health and safety. You have been out to get me from day one." And then she accused this trustee of racism. And this all leads to this investigation, which produced a 188-page report by a lawyer. This is like a single space report that the school board spent huge amounts of money, presumably, to produce. And it found that Kaplan-Meier violated the code of conduct because her behavior was, among other things, disrespectful. And there's a lot in this report. There's this part that says she violated her code of conduct for ignoring a security plan put in place for her after she had complained about, not being protected enough by the school board. And, basically, instead of going to what the school board called a safe space that they had set up for her, she went into this other room and she, kicked out her colleagues and was yelling at them because she wanted to talk to the media. And there's another part in the report about an allegation that she, instead of, following her safety plan, she baited Rebel News because she really, I guess, wanted to talk to them, even though she was saying on Twitter she was afraid of them. And so not sure if that's true or not, but the lawyer that did this code of conduct review found that she, quote, chose a path of conduct that she knew or ought to have reasonably known would create an intimidating environment, which did not contribute to a respectful workplace, and that she did not make every reasonable effort to resolve the issues arising from friction, conflict, or disagreement in a respectful and professional manner. And then as a result of this report, trustees voted to find that she had violated the code of conduct and they sanctioned her. Her punishment is that she can't attend the next school board meeting in January and she can't sit on committees for 3 months, which actually sounds like more of a reward than a punishment if you've ever sat on a committee. But the point is, as much as I don't like Kaplan-Meier's politics or her tactics, these code of conduct reports are such a waste of time and money, and they're also a free speech concern for me. These codes of conduct say you can't say anything disrespectful, but this just allows other trustees to sort of weaponize these codes of conduct when, we elect school board trustees to debate things and we want them to be able to have that vigorous debate that some people might interpret as disrespectful without facing punishment. And these codes of conduct are increasingly used to just attack, political opponents, whether it's a school board or whether it's on city councils. We've seen cases where city councils have taken away the pay for months of their fellow councilors because they didn't like things that they said. And so as much as I don't really like Kaplan-Meier's tactics, I think this whole code of conduct process is just a bad legal take and odious from a free expression point of view. So that's it. That's my take. Christine, let's hear yours.
Yeah, I agree with you completely, Josh. I think Kaplan-Meier is, to use my son's favorite term, I think she's cuckoo bananas. But I think that
That's putting it kindly.
The use of these code of conducts is a huge problem in municipalities across Ontario, where they're used to just silence people on city council who do things that some councillors just don't like. They don't like some certain councillor, and they cost a fortune. And this is a big problem, especially for small municipalities. Well, let's go to my bad legal take, which comes from former Canadian Supreme Court Chief Justice Beverly McLaughlin. And the bloom is off the rose for me when it comes to McLaughlin, who, when I was a student, was someone who I really looked up to. And now, just a few examples, her dissenting opinion in the famous free expression case Keegstra had some really important language about the value of freedom of expression. Just an example, she said, attempts to confine the guarantee of free expression only to content which is judged to possess redeeming value or to accord with the accepted values strikes at the very essence of the value of freedom of expression. And her opinion in CanLII, which is the 2005 decision from the Supreme Court in a legal challenge to the Canadian government's monopoly healthcare system, that was also very inspiring. She wrote, access to a waiting list is not access to healthcare. Now, I just do not understand how she went from being that person to who she seems to be now. So she retired from the Supreme Court and now sits on the Hong Kong Court of Final Appeal as a foreign judge. There are 10 temporary foreign judges on the Hong Kong court. And the court this week began the trial of publisher and entrepreneur Jimmy Lai, and the trial is under the Chinese national security law. As the publisher of a large publication called Apple News, Mr. Lai was extremely critical of Beijing, and once the national security law came into effect, he was one of about 250 Hong Kongers who were arrested since 2020 on these trumped up national security charges. Basically, his offense was embarrassing Beijing with this relentless advocacy for democratic freedoms and opposition to the national security law. He was then charged and marched out of his publishing offices and arrested. Like many other people who have been charged under the law, Mr. Lai has been denied bail. He's been denied the right to a jury, and he's been denied his right to choice of lawyer to represent him in court. He faces the rest of his life in prison if he is convicted. And his lawyers, the ones who he hired but are not allowed to actually represent him, they see a guilty verdict as a foregone conclusion. They think he's going to be convicted. Now, McLaughlin sits on the court that is trying him, but she is not one of the judges that is going to be hearing his case. Foreign judges like McLaughlin do not hear national security cases. But she is serving, I think, as window dressing for the authoritarian regime in Beijing. And she has been called on by many people to resign from her role because it serves this window dressing function. Lai's son asked her to resign. Lai's lawyer asked her to resign. And there are other foreign judges who sat on the court, and when the national security law came into effect, they resigned their role of the court because they were afraid of this exact thing, of being used as window dressing for an authoritarian law. Now, McLaughlin refuses to resign. And my bad legal take of the week goes to her for her reason why she won't. She's quoted in the Globe and Mail saying, the court is doing a terrific job of helping maintain rights for people insofar as the law permits. It's crazy.
It's a pretty big disclaimer.
Yeah, exactly. That's a pretty big asterisk. Yeah. So the evidence that she gave to support this statement was, she gave an example of a case where the Hong Kong court upheld a decision giving equal inheritance rights to same-sex couples over objections from Beijing. And like, fine, that's nice, that's good. But it's not exactly the same thing as throwing someone in jail for life because he criticized the government. And the rule of law in Hong Kong courts has been fundamentally poisoned by the national security law. And no, smiley face, gender and sexual orientation equity and inheritance is going to overshadow the fact that they're throwing their political opponents in jail without lawyers, without access to bail, and without the ability to choose a jury. And I mean, it's absolutely scandalous. And I think McLaughlin is naive or worse in thinking that there is any role for her in this court aside from helping to lend her hard-earned credibility to an oppressive regime. So that's my bad legal take. Joanna, how about you?
Yeah, so the use of stereotypes about conjugal satisfaction has made it into another criminal sentencing decision. So this is a ruling from the BC Provincial Court where Justice Galati accepted the findings of a psychiatric assessment that lack of sex in a marital couple was a factor in why a Vancouver man secretly recorded an international student who was living in his home as she was naked or partly dressed. And so the accused was given a conditional discharge contingent on completing probation, pretty light sentence. He had been charged and pleaded guilty to voyeurism, which has a maximum sentence of 5 years imprisonment. He was a 43-year-old father renting a bedroom to this international student, and she discovered that the toothbrush charger in the bathroom, very clever, that she shared with his teenage daughter was a spy cam for him to,
that's even worse.
Peeping Tom on her. And so the judge said,
that means he was spying on his daughter too.
Yeah.
Disgusting. Yeah.
This is even worse than I thought.
It's
anyway.
really bad. So the judge said, at bar, the offense is not trivial, but it's also not the most serious end of the spectrum either. Further, it appears that the offender's actions were out of character. And as described in the psych assessment, it appears that marital intimacy deficits contributed to the offending conduct. Now, the first part maybe seem icky, the part about that, on the spectrum, it's not the worst conduct. It always sounds icky, but you kind of have to make distinctions that are always going to be distasteful. That, yes, put a peeping Tom camera is not as bad as actual sexual assault, is not as bad as various types of sexual assault. So I don't actually object to that. But this part about marital defects and how much conjugal satisfaction this 43-year-old was getting in his marriage, that somehow justifies or mitigates the moral blameworthiness. First of all, as like an empirical matter, I don't agree. I think creeps are creeps and pervs are pervs. And we have lots of instances of men who are, to quote our late mayor, getting more than enough to eat at home and still engage in creepy conduct. Although Rob Ford said that he did not do that, and rest in peace. But second
Must
of all,
have been one of his drunken stupors.
yeah, it relies on ridiculous stereotypes.
It's like, have sex with your husband or he'll turn into a perv.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe the government should rethink their porn blocking if this is where it leads.
Yeah. So at best, it's a logical non sequitur. At worst, it relies on some of the worst discriminatory stereotypes. Yes, that wives, you have a conjugal duty to your husband, or he may put a spy cam in the au pair's toothbrush holder. It's
so
preposterous. And we've seen this pop up occasionally in the wild ride that is criminal courts. So bad legal take. No, sir. Your wife cannot be blamed for your creepy perv activities. So that's it for me.
All right, that's it for the show too. So as usual, we hope you'll rate us, review us, and subscribe. And I really do mean go rate and review us right now. Otherwise, I will accuse you of violating the Not Reserving Judgment Code of Conduct. And just a reminder, you can support our work by subscribing to the Canadian Constitution Foundation's YouTube channel, by visiting our website, theccf.ca, and signing up for our Freedom Update newsletter, where you can stay in touch with everything we're working on, written by our colleague Russ. And just a reminder that we are a nonpartisan legal charity funded by donations. So please do donate if you can. And remember that if you donate by the end of this year, which is coming up very soon, you will be able to double your impact because a group of generous donors has agreed to match whatever we raise up to $100,000. Thanks for listening.